Atlantis Revisited 6. Introduction. In this video, we'll be taking a closer look at the Burckle impact of about 2,900 years BCE in the southern Indian Ocean. The experts at Columbia University suspect this was a large comet, and that its penetration of the deep ocean and of the Earth's crust several kilometers below its surface caused the deluges and inundations reported in many a regional flood myth dating from the ensuing time frame. These include the Chaldean deluge account from Assyrian and Babylonian texts, the Great Destruction of Deucalion in Greek mythology, the Deluge of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamian mythology, and the Deluge of Noah in Hebrew mythology. In keeping with the spirit of all previous volumes in this series, this volume is predicated on the earnest intentions of ancient authors, and on the historicity of what they have assured us in their chosen mode of delivery and subject to the conventions of their time, actually transpired. When they invoke the gods or other heavenly powers, we understand, moreover, that they do so in an attempt to understand and explain what their sources witnessed in the absence of modern science. Thus, methodically reading their observations in the light of modern science, and setting aside their religious interpretations, we gain insight into the plain reality that inspired what they recorded for the benefit of those to follow. In his 1882 book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, Ignatius Donnelly conflates the biblical deluge circa 2,900 years BCE with the destruction of Atlantis circa 9,500 years BCE, simply because no one then knew about the Burckle crater at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, let alone the Younger Dryas meltwater pulse 1b. Donnelly, in other words, had a multitude of deluge myths from various sources, but only the myths themselves, their dates of origin according to the archaeologists who unearthed them, and the scholars who translated and interpreted them to guide him. He lacked the benefit of the modern climatological markers that might otherwise have helped him to nail down these events and deconflate them, to separate and order them along a scientifically constructed timeline. While the biblical deluge, according to the regional flood myths, correlates well with the Burckle impact, the destruction of Atlantis, according to Plato, lines up on the modern climatological timeline to the onset of the Younger Dryas meltwater pulse 1b, which predates the Burckle impact by about 6,500 years. Because no one in Donnelly's day knew about the Burckle impact, we owe Donnelly our forbearance. Wherever we see him, try to correlate every deluge myth on record to the destruction of Atlantis. We also owe Donnelly our forbearance as touching the location of Atlantis. The later geographical and geophysical discoveries that were not available to Donnelly also include the Richat structure in Mauritania. Without knowledge of the Richat structure, Donnelly had only the recent soundings of the Azores Plateau by HMS Challenger in 1872 to 1876, leading up to the publication of his book on Atlantis in 1882. These sounding results shouted out to anyone familiar with Plato's account that the Azores Plateau must have been the now sunken location of lost Atlantis. From Donnelly's perspective, the HMS Challenger sounding results made the Azores Plateau the single and uncontested candidate for this location, based on a plain reading of Plato's Timaeus and Critias. Not knowing in 1882 what we know today about the disqualifying tectonic and volcanic history of the Azores Plateau, and with no one having taken a closer look at Plato's choice of words in describing the subsidence and disappearance of the Atlantean urban center, Donnelly was as correct as anyone could be in his day to propose the Azores Plateau as its geographical location. Donnelly thrived in the Gilded Age, during which there was no better candidate location for lost Atlantis. Thus, having begun to untangle Donnelly's narrative, we are not here to critique it at length, but to look more closely at the natural phenomena described in his ancient sources. I open with these critiques so that you can understand that I'm not taking everything Donnelly wrote at face value, as many researchers still seem to do, even to this day. Atlantis Revisited 6. The Waterspout. In the Chaldean Deluge account from the ruins of ancient Uruk, the waterspout, as it is called in the translation that Donnelly uses, is translated as a whirlwind in the George Smith translation used in the Project Gutenberg version. George Smith translation, Tablet 11, Column 3, lines 19 to 23. 6 days and nights passed, the wind, the whirlwind, and the storm overwhelmed. On the 7th day, at its approach, the rain was stayed. The raging whirlwind, which had smitten like an earthquake, was quieted. The sea began to dry, and the wind and deluge ended. The translation Donnelly uses, in which a waterspout is an element of the storm that brings a catastrophic deluge, differs somewhat from that used by George Smith, the author of the Project Gutenberg version entitled The Chaldean Account of Genesis. Smith translates this atmospheric phenomenon as a whirlwind. While a waterspout is indeed a kind of whirlwind, the more specific term is significant. In either case, the text links it causally with the deluge, which lends support to its interpretation as a waterspout. Provided only that we can imagine a waterspout of not just literally, but specifically biblical proportions, the translation that Donnelly uses suggests an additional transport mechanism for the waters of an oceanic bolide-induced deluge, after the explosive forces of the initial impact have created the rim wave, the splash curtain, and the atmospheric debris plume. For reasons to become apparent in reciting the translation, there is reason to interpret this waterspout of biblical proportions as the post-impact driver of this additional water vapor transport mechanism. In Chapter 3 of Donnelly's Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, entitled The Deluge of the Chaldeans. The cuneiform tablet inscriptions that mention the waterspout begin as follows. And the god Ea, the immutable Lord, repeated this command in a dream. I listened to the decree of fate that he announced, and he said to me, Man of Shuripak, son of Ubaratutu, thou build a vessel and finish it quickly. By a deluge I will destroy substance and life. Cause thou to go up into the vessel the substance of all that has life. The vessel thou shalt build, 600 cubits shall be the measure of its length, and 60 cubits the amount of its breadth and of its height. Launch if thus on the ocean, and cover it with a roof. The Chaldean inscriptions continue. The terrible deluge on men swelled up to heaven. The brother no longer saw his brother. Men no longer knew each other. In heaven, the gods became afraid of the waterspout, and sought a refuge. They mounted up to the heaven of Anu. "6 days and as many nights passed. The wind, the waterspout, and the diluvian rain were all in their strength. At the approach of the 7th day, the diluvian rain grew weaker. The terrible waterspout, which had assailed after the fashion of an earthquake, grew calm. The sea inclined to dry up, and the wind and the waterspout came to an end. I looked at the sea, attentively observing, and the whole of humanity had returned to mud. Like unto seaweeds, the corpses floated. I opened the window, and the light smote on my face. I was seized with sadness. I sat down and I wept, and my tears came over my face. Let the gods come to my sacrificial pile, but never may Bel come to my sacrificial pile. For he did not master himself, and he has made the waterspout for the deluge, and he has numbered my men for the pit. In the text of their account, the Chaldeans linked the waterspout causally to the deluge. The god Bel, quote, has made the waterspout for the deluge, end quote. The waterspout is thus described as a necessary part of the deluge. When the waterspout was spinning at peak intensity, the diluvian rain, as they called it, poured down, quote, 6 days and nights, end quote, in volumes enough to raise the protagonist's purpose-built vessel of 60 by 60 by 600 cubits. When it stopped raining, the waterspout spun down. By these accounts, the Chaldeans could clearly see that the waterspout and the deluge were causally linked. Critically, those who listened carefully to the text will have noticed that the Chaldeans also linked the waterspout, quote, which had assailed after the fashion of an earthquake, end quote, to what could scarcely have been other than a major and deeply penetrating oceanic bolide strike some 5,000 years ago. Impact, Debris plume and waterspout. It's all right there in some of the most ancient inscriptions ever unearthed. As the video progresses, we will examine the eyewitness accounts reported in the scientific paper on the Burckle impact, of the debris plume and of the formation of the waterspout, whose loud roaring, so they say, could be heard all the way from India, which was far over the horizon, and whose southern tip lies some 4,700 kilometers to the north by northeast of the Burckle abyssal impact crater. Perhaps no one who witnessed the impact itself survived to tell about it, or perhaps their accounts were just never written down. There was plenty of time, after all, to witness the debris plume and the waterspout, but only minutes or seconds to witness the impact. Perhaps everyone on the planet, on the other hand, felt the earthquake it triggered, and, evidence of which we shall find in due course, heard the thunderclap of the shock front, which would have circled the globe probably more than once, as in the case of the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, the year after Donnelly published his book. Because the primary impact would have happened so quickly, however, there would have been far fewer line-of-sight eyewitnesses to that than to the earthquake and to the immediate and extended aftermath of both. In addition to the eyewitness accounts, we will also take a much closer look at that waterspout. The translation that Donnelly uses, in which waterspout is used in place of whirlwind, helps us to resolve one of the findings of Abbott et al. In their seminal report on the Burckle impact, to wit, we also find that a 29-kilometer wide source crater cannot vaporize enough seawater to produce meters of rain, even in a restricted region between 4,750 and 7,250 kilometers from the crater. Thus, we infer that Burckle crater was produced as part of a shoemaker levee type impact of a comet. The fragmented comet also produced two other large impact centers, one in the northwest Pacific and another in the central eastern Pacific. Where the rainout from these impact centers overlaps, we see deluge events that are over a week long. The impact event also produced devastating tsunamis, winds, and associated social upheaval. After running their calculations in an attempt to account for the deluges depicted in the regional accounts handed down to us, about 7 days in the Chaldean legend and several weeks in the Hebrew legend, and for the total volume of vaporized seawater needed to supply them, Dr. Abbott and her colleagues failed to get enough lofted seawater out of the 3 fragment impact sites they identified. They got a little over a week's worth of catastrophic rainfall around the other proposed impact sites, but only where the rainouts intersected. Concerning the Burckle impact site in the southern Indian Ocean, Abbott and her colleagues determined, as noted above, that we also find that a 29-kilometer wide source crater cannot vaporize enough seawater to produce meters of rain, even in a restricted region between 4,750 and 7,250 kilometers from the crater. After all that was said and done, they concluded that an impact sufficiently large to produce a 29-kilometer crater could not have produced a global deluge by itself. We conclude that there must be effects that are not included in the previous calculations. There's another possibility to consider, however, as a source of, for example, the apocryphal 40 days and 40 nights reported by Moses, a possibility that also sorts well with the Chaldean legend of the Waterspout, which describes an equally catastrophic deluge lasting 7 days. This waterspout reported in the Chaldean legend could have been a phenomenon known in modern cosmogenic climatology as a hypercane. A hypercane, as alluded earlier, of not just literally, but of specifically biblical proportions. Neither the oceanic bolide strike simulations performed at Los Alamos National Laboratory, nor the seminal paper on the Burckle impact in 2005 took account of whether the Burckle impact circa 2,900 years BCE created a hypercane. In August 2000, however, 5 years before the Burckle paper, John Woodmorappy had already proposed in the Journal of Creation that hypercanes could be the engines driving the catastrophic rainfall in global deluges, such as the one described in the biblical deluge myth. First proposed by MIT meteorology and hurricane dynamics professor Kerry Emanuel and his colleagues in 1995, per Wikipedia, a hypercane is a hypothetical class of extreme tropical cyclone that could form if sea surface temperatures reached approximately 50 degrees centigrade or 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 12 degrees centigrade or 22 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the warmest ocean temperature ever recorded. Such an increase in temperature could be caused by a large asteroid or comet impact, a large supervolcanic eruption, a large submarine flood basalt, which is an undersea lava flow, or incredible global warming. It is, of course, the case of a large asteroid or comet that we are interested in for present purposes. A hypercane sets up a pumping mechanism driven by the scalding heat of the surface water above the impact site. This thermal convection lofts untold millions of tons of water vapor into the lower and upper atmosphere in a sustained capacity for as long as the ocean surface above the impact site remains above the threshold temperature of about 50 degrees centigrade. In the eyewitness accounts of the Burckle deluge, moreover, that, quote, talk about hot water falling from the sky, end quote, we can interpret hypercanes as the suppliers of the thermal energy needed to initiate and to drive the formative stages of the meltwater pulses, as we call them, that we find in the climatological record. If there is any validity whatsoever to Dr. Emanuel's hypercane theory, or shall we say, if ever a hypercane was indeed created anywhere, then a very powerful hypercane would have formed over the 29-kilometer Burckle crater very soon after impact. We've already established that the waterspout of the Chaldeans was causally linked to the deluge they survived to tell us about, and that they considered it important enough to mention several times. What else could they have been describing but the central axis of a hypercane, held in place by the fixed hotspot, scalding and roiling the ocean that supplied it with thermal energy, a hotspot that eventually solidified into the Berkel abyssal crater, whose presence has been confirmed through careful analysis of core samples. The Chaldeans, of course, could not have understood most of this. They knew and recorded what they saw, however, from the great distance needed for them to survive the impact, rising up over the horizon and filling the sky with dense clouds. They called it a waterspout or a whirlwind and could plainly see that it had something to do with the catastrophe they lived firsthand over the ensuing week, describing, quote, the terrible deluge on men that swelled up to heaven, end quote. How else could a deluge swell up to heaven, as they described it, than by the explosive transport mechanism of a bolide impact, or by the sustaining convective action of a hypercane? We also know that the calculations of Abbott et al. Revealed that neither the Berkel impact nor the additional impact sites they proposed could have lofted enough seawater to feed a global deluge. Yet they did find evidence of tsunamis and rainouts in various places around the world. Another reason to understand the waterspout of the Chaldeans as the twisting and roaring hub of a hypercane is that 4,870 meters, that's 3 miles of seawater, lies between the crater thus formed as we see it today and the air above it. Regardless of how much further this impact can be supposed to have punched into the seafloor crust, which, as illustrated in this cutaway diagram, is much thinner than the continental crust, it would have produced a significant and lasting hotspot on the ocean floor. By introducing a sustained heat source under that 3 miles of seawater that roiled and then boiled above it, an initially 29-kilometer wide column of searing hot water would have risen to the surface by thermal convection and spread out over the surface. It's not easy to illustrate this in a naive society, in many ways still just emerging from the desolations of the Berkel deluge, a society that in its own collective memory has never had to endure an oceanic bolide-induced hypercane, let alone had the opportunity to collect the data that would be needed to reconstruct it. Not surprisingly, my internet searches are not turning up anything. Because of this lack of direct experience on the part of the society in which they are developed, today's generative AI tools have no precedent in their knowledge bases upon which to draw for the astrophysical, geophysical, and climatological details of a natural cataclysm of this magnitude. What we can scarcely imagine, AI can scarcely reconstruct. Nevertheless, the conditions needed to create and sustain a cosmogenic hypercane for an extended period would in this way have been not just satisfied but far exceeded by the Berkel impact. I read in one of the academic articles that 50 degrees centigrade can sear a rare steak, with the understanding that a rare steak should not, under any circumstances, be boiled in seawater. 50 degrees centigrade is a very easy mark to cross and to remain above for a cometary impact of Berkel magnitude. Dr. Emanuel's 1995 hypercane theory, together with John Woodmorappy's 2011 proposition linking hypercanes to deluge myths provide us with an additional source of the water needed to create and feed a global deluge of the magnitude reported by the ancients in these 5 deluge myths, to name but a few. The Deluge of the Chaldeans in Assyrian and Babylonian traditions. The Mesopotamian Deluge in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Hebrew Deluge of Noah in the Old Testament. The Great Destruction of Deucalion in Greek mythology. The destruction of the Third World in Native American tradition. Why, we might ask, do all of these deluge myths tell similar stories? While some would argue that they are all derived from a single story, the discovery, location, and dating of the Berkel impact in 2005 suggests a different accounting for their similarity. That they are all echoes in stone, tradition, or scripture of the same natural cataclysm. The Berkel impact, circa 2,900 years BCE, in the southern Indian Ocean. They vary in their details as might the eyewitness accounts of any event, because of differences in the locations and vantage points of the observers, differences in their interpretations, or differences in recollection. So many of these similar accounts have emerged simply because the event upon which they are based happened only 5,000 years ago. Yet so many in academia will insist that no civilization worth recording even emerged until 5,000 years ago. The list of natural cataclysms that may have created hypercanes grows longer when we prefix the Berkel impact with the onset of the Older Dryas Cold Period circa 12,000 BCE at the end of the Pleistocene epoch. The Younger Dryas impact associated with the onset of the Greenland Cold Period and the disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America circa 10,900 BCE, and the Phaeton mythos associated with the destruction of Atlantis circa 9,400 BCE, and the onset of the Younger Dryas meltwater pulse 1b. The perilous future of this timeline is, of course, always open to unexpected revision. In another paper by Dr. Emmanuel and his colleagues, hypercanes are suggested as a possible contributor to the demise of the dinosaurs about 66 million years ago. Notice the word case here, indicating multiple hypercanes rather than just one big one. As this supplementary theory goes, hypercanes are repeatedly spun off from the roiling waters covering the superhot impact site to run their course and wreak their havoc elsewhere. The problem with elsewhere, however, is that the superhot upwelling over the impact site isn't going anywhere. Such independent hypercanes, therefore, having abandoned their energy source, would soon die out. The Chaldean account appears to choose sides here, as it repeatedly refers to a single waterspout that towered high enough for the eyewitnesses to see it from a great distance, that persisted throughout the deluge, and that spun down as the deluge ended. In the seminal scientific paper on the Berkel impact cited earlier, the authors also report their findings from regional folklore. People in India observed the atmospheric debris plume and evocatively described it as doomsday clouds that look like a herd of elephants, emitting lightning, roaring loudly. These dense elephantine clouds fill up the sky. Several Indian myths describe fiery particles falling from the sky at the beginning of the deluge, as do myths from the Congo region of Africa and New Guinea, a seeming referent to the ballistic re-entry through the atmosphere of superheated ejecta. In a similar vein, other myths from Iraq, India, and New Guinea talk about hot water falling from the sky. As noted in the Wikipedia article on hypercanes, a critical difference between a hypercane and present-day hurricanes is that a hypercane would extend into the upper stratosphere. Thus, towering high into the stratosphere, a hypercane would have been visible to ground-based observers several thousand kilometers away 5,000 years ago. And don't forget, audible too, according to the folklore, roaring loudly all the way across those same thousands of kilometers on the other side of the equator from India. The language in the Indian folklore appears to side with the Chaldean mythos, in which a single towering debris plume forms up into a hypercane and rages in place for days and weeks. Up to a certain hotspot diameter, it's the only side of the argument that makes much sense given the conditions needed to create and sustain a hypercane. Conditions anchored to a single ocean surface location, overlying a fixed seafloor hotspot. In the Navajo origin story, Diné Bahaneʼ, or Four Worlds, the Diné Story of Creation, authors Joseph Bruchac and Michael J. Caduto describe the destruction event that ended the third world, and from which the fourth world we all inhabit today thus emerged. 4 days passed, and then a great noise was heard all around the third world. Begochity knew what it was, knew what was going to happen. Someone had done wrong. Now this third world was about to be destroyed by flood. From the east, a black storm came. From the south, a blue storm approached. From the west came a yellow storm. From the north, a white storm swept. This perspective from prehistoric North America on the opposite side of the globe from the southern Indian Ocean supports the idea of a global deluge resulting from the Berkel impact. As might be expected at this location, no towering waterspout is seen, but the surround sound report of the shock front from the explosive impact in the text of the Navajo legend, quote, "A great noise was heard all around the third world, end quote. Perhaps more than once. In some places, perhaps even the sustained noise of the core of the raging hypercane that spun up above the impact site, quote, roaring loudly, end quote, as the people in faraway India described it, is also heard round the world. Either way, based on the Navajo legend, we can reasonably infer that it was the hypercane, those four colorful storms that swept in from all directions as the hypercane enveloped the globe, that brought catastrophic flooding to North America. As reported by Abbott et al. In 2005, the Burckle debris plume, even when added to those of the additional fragment impacts, were not enough to do that on their own. What I'm proposing here, of course, is that a hypercane is what the Chaldeans saw and called the waterspout, or the whirlwind in their account of this natural catastrophe. As noted before, the idea is not new that hypercanes could be the engines driving the catastrophic rainfall in global deluges, such as the one described in the regional flood myths surrounding the Burckle crater. John Woodmorappy proposed this in 2011, though he doesn't seem to have connected his idea to the waterspout in the Chaldean legend. Having proposed, nevertheless, that hypercanes have been the driving forces behind many an ancient deluge, absent the inspiration of the waterspout of the Chaldeans, remains a fine boast for him to make. The Chicxulub crater under the Yucatan Peninsula off Central America formed about 66 million years ago and ended the Cretaceous period in geologic history, along with the non-avian dinosaurs who thrived in it. The Chicxulub crater is about 150 kilometers in diameter, as compared to the far more recent 29-kilometer Burckle crater in the southern Indian Ocean. The Chicxulub object itself was between 11 and 80 kilometers wide, and is thought to have plunged 20 kilometers deep into the abyssal crust. The seafloor crust ranges in thickness from 5 to 10 kilometers, so it should be understood that the Chicxulub impactor plunged all the way through the abyssal crust, with enough kinetic and heat energy to form a temporary magma lake. This lake of molten lava would then cool down over time and congeal back into a crustal basalt, thus replacing the shattered crust that had previously lain there. A bolide that punches through the Earth's crust enters the upper mantle, whose temperature ranges from about 227 to 930 degrees centigrade. Until the resulting magma lake cools, therefore, it stores and slowly releases the accumulated geothermal energy of the upper mantle, combined with the bolide's heat of impact. This helps to explain the intensity and longevity of the hypercane driven by the resulting seafloor hotspot. Since the extinction-level Chicxulub impact penetrated water in what is now the Gulf of Mexico before it struck the abyssal crust, this residual geothermal energy combined and militated with the kinetic heat of impact to boil and vaporize the water above it, and to raise and sustain a formidable and persistent hypercane. The Burckle impactor created a much smaller crater at 29 kilometers, but struck the seafloor in a region of tectonic spreading, which is where the oceanic crust is thinnest. If the Burckle object also created a transient magma lake under that 3.8 kilometers of seawater, it could help to explain the intensity and longevity of the resulting waterspout, as they called it, or whirlwind, as attested in the Chaldean inscriptions in association with the globe-spanning deluge reported in the regional folklore all around the world. It is evident from this wide array of independent yet roughly contemporaneous folklore that these conditions persisted until the magma lake and the ocean water above it cooled back down below the hypercane threshold ocean surface temperature of 50 degrees centigrade. The word waterspout occurs just 5 times in the cuneiform inscriptions discovered on Tablet 11 of the Sacred Books of Babylon that Donnelly tells us were taken, quote, from a very ancient specimen in the sacerdotal library of the town of Uruk, end quote, in the 8th century BC, from which the deluge myth, quote, was introduced by Berosus into the history that he wrote for the use of the Greeks, end quote. Almost 3,000 years later, to my own satisfaction in any event, we've come full circle from waterspout to hypercane in finally figuring out what those cryptic cuneiform inscriptions meant some 5,000 years ago. Atlantis Revisited 6. Apocrypha. It should be understood in forensic philology, which is what we're doing when we try to understand ancient texts in modern terms, that certain elements of those texts can be safely set aside from a rational assessment. These are called apocrypha, interpretations usually of a religious or mythological nature that have been handed down to us as embellishments of otherwise rational historical accounts. Because it happened so recently and long enough after the Phaeton impact to allow culture, religion, and record-keeping to once again proliferate, the Burckle impact inspired more than its share among deluge myths of persistent apocrypha. Some of you may already be familiar with apocrypha and with how to recognize and disregard it in forensic philology. For those of you not irrevocably committed to the letter of Scripture, it's just common sense, as I secretly suspect it was for people of rational minds, eager for legends of practical value, all the way back to the beginning of folklore in prehistoric times. I can see him now, Gary Larson's thick-limbed denizen Grog of the Pleistocene epoch, nodding in constant agreement by the campfire as he listens to another folk legend, quietly picking out the real story in fragments as he picks out the juiciest parts of his rib steak, and sets aside the apocrypha as he sets aside the parsley, which his wife has told him repeatedly is just for looks. An understanding of Apocrypha will allow you to expertly handle many objections that people on the verge of a rational understanding might raise as you try to guide them around the Apocrypha in ancient texts. Many of weak mind and destructive temperament will make red herrings of Apocrypha, by which to lasso and drag down the entire mythos. Our putative exemplar Grog lived 10 to 20,000 years ago, but knew better than to toss out the whole ribsteak unfinished, just because of the parsley that he's not supposed to eat in the first place. In like manner, he knew better than to dismiss out of hand a perfectly good folk legend on account of the Apocrypha that someone added along the way, just for looks. Are we smart like Grog? In studying the destruction of Atlantis, for example, the precipitous run of Phaeton across the sky in his father's sun chariot is the apocryphal interpretation of a bolide track, as shown in Volume 1 of this series. We need not decode this apocryphon because, as also shown in that volume, the Egyptian priest Sonchis of Sais decodes it for us. For my own part, at least, as New York stand-up comedian Louis Black famously put it, the rant is due on the Apocrypha surrounding the ancient deluge myths. But the full rant, while short and sweet on its own, got a bit too long to include in this volume. Like Gary Larson's Grog, therefore, picking out parsley under the watchful eye of his family, I will fastidiously set aside the full rant on Apocrypha for another video. I'm chomping at the bit to make that short video, and I hope you'll stay tuned to ensure you don't miss it. The proliferation of survivors who lived to write down our creation myths attest that the Arks themselves and those quick-thinking farmers, cognizant of their own folklore and faithful enough to build them, can hardly be Apocrypha. Simple logic and the obvious necessity raised by the gathering Burkle hypercane also inform us that most of these arks were seaworthy, their designs no doubt well honed by the impartial selection pressures of past deluges. You remember a single deluge only, said Sonchis of Sais to Solon in Plato's Timaeus, but there were many previous ones. Any doubts as to the competence of ancient shipwrights and the seaworthiness of the ships they built are well and duly allayed by our friend Louis Black, who famously reminded us that, quote, amateurs built Noah's Ark. Professionals built the Titanic. Atlantis Revisited 6. Epilogue. In discussing Earth-crossing objects and the threats they pose, there is a tendency in social discourse to focus on tsunamis and on direct impact damage. Objects above a certain size have been recently termed city killers by the sensation-hungry yet panic-averse commercial media, as if objects of a certain size cause damage only to what they land on, and only within the proximal radius of primary particulate ejecta. The interpretation of ancient accounts, however, as exemplified in the classical era by Critias the Younger in Plato's Critias, where he begins, quote, "The land was the best in the world," end quote. And by the Roman poet Ovid in his Metamorphoses should instead inspire an appreciation for sudden, extensive, indirect, and lasting environmental consequences. According to the records handed down to us, which have been examined forensically in volumes 1 to 5 of this series, both Atlantis and prehistoric Athens were washed away by deluges and inundations, resulting from bolide impacts that most probably landed nowhere near either city. After 5 to 10,000 years of received testimony from ancient chroniclers, it's time to cultivate a more holistic appreciation of the total impulse delivered to the global environment by major bolide strikes. Depending on threat object size, mass, composition, strike point, angle of incidence, and kinetic energy, the effects can range from improved surfing conditions to food chain collapse, as described by Critias circa 400 BCE and by Publius Ovidius Naso of 1st century Rome. The Burkle object landed in the remote reaches of the Indian Ocean, yet by all accounts raised a massive hypercane and a worldwide deluge that washed countless civilizations out to sea, inspiring the Chaldeans to report that, quote, "the whole of humanity had returned to mud. Like unto seaweeds, the corpses floated," end quote. On our path to understanding what the ancients had long known in practical terms, the full range of these consequences deserves our full appreciation and our utmost in preventive industry. That's all for this volume. It's a handful, I know, but adds informative detail to the cosmogenic climatology of the Great Destruction of Deucalion, 6,500 years after Atlantis, yet 5,000 years before the present, which has shaped our modern world more than many of us might care to imagine. The post-Diluvian figures who spoke and wrote of Atlantis could not avoid mention of this most recent among the, quote, "many destructions of mankind, arising out of many causes," end quote. It's a tall order for a species known for its imminent reactivity where proaction is needed. In just this one endeavor, let's at least try to be ready ahead of time to deflect the next serious threat object before it strikes and enters the grim timeline of major destruction events. Remember the steps and mind the order. 1. Readiness. 2. Detection. 3. Interception. 4. Deflection. Remember that readiness, not detection, is step 1. Better yet, just hand the whole project over to the military. The military already understand this order of business. Readiness is the business they've been in since time immemorial. By the very definition of readiness, the subsequent steps fall into place on their own, in real time and on time, with plenty of time to spare, and with plenty of redundancies and backup plans to kick in should anything not work out as initially planned. Without readiness, the only plan is to panic, when the time for action arrives. The difference is told in the timeless lessons of history. I have several projects lined up, including a few inspired by your comments. The videos inspired by you will be duly dedicated to you by the name under which you requested them. Some of the videos to follow will be documentary like this one, while others will be fictional yarns unfolding in parallel with the documentary releases, and based on the events thus described, to explore the many worlds made possible, or probable, or in some cases inevitable, by the scenarios we might infer, by the light of observation and reason thus cast upon the dark abyss and nether reaches of deep time. The focus will remain on Lost Atlantis, or on stories or subjects like those presented in this volume that are strongly related to Atlantis for the foreseeable future. Remember what grogs say when you encounter Apocrypha while perusing an ancient text. Don't eat parsley, just for looks. As always, stay tuned.